So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming along this lunchtime to this co-badged History Talks Live and REMRA, or Renaissance and Early Modern Research Alliance Roundtable event. Today we are welcoming three speakers to reflect on doing and writing about public history as early modernists, but we're also seeking to widen the conversation and get thoughts from the audience who wish to contribute. I'm Dr. Lucy Dean, and I'm a Senior Lecturer and Curriculum Leader at the Centre for History at UHI. I'm a late medieval and early modern historian, and among many research interests, I'm particularly passionate about exploring ways and means to take history outside of academia and to empower others to get involved in doing history, particularly pre-modern history, as are many at the Centre for History more generally. And I've also been the module leader on our third year undergraduate core module, Public History, for about 4 or 5 years now. When the idea of a round table about public history and the Renaissance and early modern period arose, the issue that I kept coming back to was one that arose from working on that module. In planning and preparing materials and identifying readings and exemplars for students, there had always been, at least in the prominent public history publications, an obvious dominance of historians writing and reflecting on public history theory and practice being published about by modern historians, particularly of the 19th and 20th century, rather than early modern and medieval scholars. We know plenty of medievalists and early modernists who actively do public history, but the query or question driving the discussion today will be why there isn't more conceptual and reflective public history scholarship about the early modern period and by early modern scholars working on early modern projects. Our three speakers have worked in academia, in collaboration with heritage organisations and in the museum sector, so between them they will provide us with fascinating insights. Joining me today there is Dolly MacKinnon, who is an Associate Professor in Early Modern History at the University of Queensland, who's a cultural historian, and her work concentrates on the marginalised and institutionalised by analysing the mental, physical, including material, culture and built heritage and auditory landscapes of the past. Anna Groundwater is a cultural and social historian, currently Principal Curator of Renaissance and Early Modern History at the National Museum of Scotland, and responsible for the Scottish collections of 1450 to 1750. Her interests in material culture include meaning making and memorialisation, the perspectives it offers into the past lived experience, and audience engagement with historical objects. And our third speaker today is Rachel Delman, who is a Heritage Partnerships Coordinator in the Humanities Division at the University of Oxford. She is also a historian of late medieval and early modern Britain, specialising in gendered interpretations of buildings and their wider landscape settings. Following a PhD at Oxford, completed in 2017, Rachel held research fellowships at the University of Edinburgh and then York, and has acted as a historical consultant to several UK heritage organisations. When we discussed how the session would run, one of the first important things that came up was the question of how we were defining public history, and we settled on three main strands that sit under that umbrella that we'll attempt to speak to today. The first was academics working in collaboration with heritage bodies and organisations to largely disseminate information to the public. The second was academics or heritage professionals working in collaboration with the public in professionally led projects. And the third was academics or heritage professionals co-producing or collaborating with the public in grassroots-led projects. Each of our panellists will introduce themselves more fully and offer examples of projects that they have been involved in that speak to one or more of these definitions or strands of public history, and each speaker will have about 10 minutes to do this. Following this, we plan to have a semi-structured discussion for the remainder of the session that will hopefully touch upon some or all of the following key points: problems of compartmentalisation, where we publish and issues of gatekeeping, legacy, and embracing risk. In this discussion, although I will aim the initial questions at the panel of speakers, we also really hope that there'll be plenty of audience participation in this discussion and chances for questions from the audience as well. You can ask questions or offer comments either by putting up your hand, and there's a little hands up icon at the bottom right hand side near the little face where you can do a reaction as well. Or you can write your question or comment in the chat, and either myself or Catherine will feed that into the conversation. Before we do that, however, I'd like to hand over to our speakers. So in the first instance, I'm going to hand over to Dolly once I've just shared her slides very quickly.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to offer an acknowledgement of country before we begin to the First Peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the land and waterways on which I speak to you from today in Naarm, the Wurundjeri, and also the Turrbal and Jagera people in Queensland, where this research was also conducted. I think it's a very interesting thing to be asked what kind of historian you are. And I always have trouble with this. When Lucy asked me, who am I, and could I give a brief description of myself, I proceed to go into a meltdown, unable to categorize myself, but I could be this, I could be that. So I find that always very challenging. So I thought, well, the thing to do in looking at how our history is public and how we interact with the public is, I thought the key question for me is always about who gets to tell your story. And I think that's a really important one because it points to the way that histories and stories are multiple and conflicting. So there is no one story, although there are traditional stories that we tell about ourselves or are told about ourselves. Ultimately, my aim in history that I've done has been to, if you look at the mirror down in the right-hand corner of your screen, if I had this profound moment standing in front of a mirror in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and I'm looking into this mirror and I realize that everything that is in that mirror is reflected. But in the history disciplines that we have, not everything is reflected. So I think that's a really important thing to do, whether it's the Covenanters, whether it's enslaved children, whether it's the music that I've written about in terms of Scottish households. So ultimately, my aim within the histories that I write are to democratize the past in the present. So can we see ourselves in that past? And with that comes the necessity about being able to make that past accessible. So access the archives, access the writing. So paleography is a major thing that I do with my classes. If you give students the capacity to unpick the past, they can go searching for themselves. And I think the other thing within that is also to allow the students a capacity to actually choose their own stories and histories that they want to look at. Now, that's difficult when you're in a situation where your work has to be assessed for a university course. But often public history, because of how we set these things up, enables us to do this without the need for assessment. So we can actually succeed and fail on the strength of what we actually get to look at. So that challenge then also brings in the need to question some of the hierarchies that govern our histories. So, for example, family history is okay if you come from a bloodline that gives you monarchy. It's all right to do family history there. But it's not considered so palatable to look at family history from the bottom up. And so you might have gathered that I'm a historian from below. I like to prove people wrong and show how people, even the lowest he's and she's, can be discovered in the past. So the challenge then comes through to what do I then call myself? Now, my background is a PhD in early modern local history, and I'm a firm believer that if you get great local histories, you get enough of them, you can then write informed national histories that are fed from the bottom up. So it's not the old chestnut being run out again, but actually quality archival work. The second thing is I have a Bachelor of Music, and I studied early music, history and early music performance. So I already have different periodizations and different categorizations that come into play. The third thing is I also did a graduate certificate in higher education with a tertiary focus, which then meant that I was looking at how these types of history that I do actually impact on the way we teach students and how we can actually engage students and get them into the past. Now, all of this is fine, except as you all know, we're all creatures of our university websites, and I'm categorised as an early modern historian 10 years ago. But when they revamped the website, I became an international historian because only the Australian historians were identified by geographical regions. So IT gave us that. That was not something we even got to define for ourselves. So I think this is another thing to think about. There are these periodizations, boundaries that are created for us, and we navigate our way across them, but we're also constrained by them. So as an early modernist, there's also the global early modern. Do we describe ourselves as 17th century historians or 18th century historians? Do we take a theme like the history of emotions and then run our history through that? So that's fundamentally what sits behind my approach to things. The second thing is that public history is that junction between an audience and academics and public historians who may or may not be treated, contained in that way. Oh, sorry, I was a bit confused by the slide changing there. It's right. So academic histories are considered elite, and public histories are much broader, and they can be done by historians, but they can also be done by people with some historical skills, but not a lot. And really what you end up with is a kind of turf war between who has this and who doesn't. And that's really difficult in the academy, because the academy can view public history as not the ultimate history, and yet increasingly universities have moved towards this, as we can see with the appointment of officers who now purposely are there to get historians to engage with. So there's been a shift in the last decade. And so I think that's an important thing. The other thing I'd like to think about is, where is my public history? Because it was really interesting for me to answer Lucy's question about, what is public history? And I realised it was on the national radio, it was on the telly, it was on YouTube, it was on websites, it was in academic books, it was in academic journals, it was in music CD liner notes, and it was also in the ephemera of live performances that I've been involved in, and also lectures in museums and musical lectures that I'd given at performances before concerts. So that's what I find really interesting about the way we look at all of this. So what I'd like to do is then move to the second slide and talk about a project that I did, which hinges on students in the archive. So it's that idea of taking the students, skilling them up with paleography and getting them into the archive. Now, this is a project that was done through a scheme at the University of Queensland, which was the scheme was originally intended that students would work with an academic to create a traditional bibliography, or to learn how to transcribe a document, maybe, but not really. They would basically be used to provide bibliographic material. There was no limitations on what you could do, so I charged in, thought for myself, acted for others, and came up with this scheme where I negotiated a 3-week project, or 3-part project, with the Queensland State Archives to look at their early colonial records to do with convicts. So stage 1 of the project was done online, and the students read up on the material beforehand. It was advertised nationally, and we had national students coming in, and we had 3 students who were involved in this. And stage 2 actually got them to the archives. Now, at this point, the state archivist and another archivist came in and spoke and worked with the students, and they were given a private office in the research room, and they were actually given access to the convict registers. Now, that does not happen. Those registers are normally on microfiche, and nobody gets to handle them. So this was absolutely fantastic, and they had an individual archivist working with each of them, following up their questions and queries. So it enabled a complete access for these students, which was terrific. The second part was to create a series of narratives, because the project was called Personal Stories, Perilous Crossings. And it was to show the multicultural nature of Queensland. And this is pretty much what it did. Now, the students were allowed to drive those projects, and they did. And that was because they had their own particular interests. Now, as it turned out, one of them was a migrant to Australia and was particularly interested in the travelling of one particular convict. And Tess wrote about Francis, the convict she chose to write about, and she stated, "They stated I was 5'6" tall, 30 years old, a black man, and that I was a servant by trade. It is in this record that the only reference to my place of origin, Africa, is made. I was given a prisoner number. From then on, in my new country, I would be identified by my name, my number, and the ship I arrived on." And so what she'd done was actually using the present tense and the past tense had created this personal narrative where we felt we actually knew Francis. Now, this was at a time when it was just starting to break that there was a diverse, I mean, people knew there were diverse convicts, but the populace were beginning to know this because of the "who do you think you are" stories that were coming through, where people were having to realize that, you know, the relatives they thought they knew, they didn't know. They were much more interesting and diverse than they'd thought. The other thing that happened out of the project was that Daniel, who was in the project, he was one of the students in the project, was also a gifted artist. So he created this WordPress site for us, and they proceeded to load up their blogs about the students over the next 2-3 months. So it was absolutely brilliant in terms of the unexpectedness of it. I guess the other thing is that this is a move away from the traditional sorts of approaches to history. And as I said, it was not assessed. So what we had was this fantastic resource, which was then used by the QSA, Queensland State Archives. Now, the final example I want to give you, if you could move to the next slide, please, Lucy, is Wunderkammer, which was an exhibition put on in conjunction with a major conference. And the University of Queensland Art Museum agreed to put on an exhibition for 3 months, and we put together a collection of all the items that the university had. And this is the interesting thing. The university had loads of early modern things. It just didn't realise it had them. So we brought them all out, and the exhibition was done in 2 parts: the early modern stuff, medieval early modern stuff, and then the contemporary art, which is what you see here. There's a beautiful picture of a contemporary response to the kinds of things that were being collected in Wunderkammer, with birds and insects and metallurgy and all sorts of things. So that was a really important thing. Now, why I wanted to show you this slide was because it's what's not included here. One of the items that I wanted to include was a fantastic painting by Brax, and we had permission to use it for the conference organisation. But because the hanger in the gallery said he could not hang it in the gallery, we could not have it. So sometimes omissions occur through no fault of your own, but through a kind of curatorial necessity. And the other thing that happens too is that all projects are curated. There are choices you make to include and exclude. And I think that's an important thing to remember. The final slide is about the idea of legacies. Now, I'd written on the Covenanters, and then I was approached by the Edinburgh World Heritage Organisation to give a YouTube contribution to a large session they did a year ago about this. So the other thing I'd say is you just never know what your work will do or what it might influence. I've done probably 5 different programs with Who Do You Think You Are? And what you're doing there is you're actually promoting research, and you're also promoting other people's research that the researchers may not know about. So I think that's the other thing. It's that sense of being able to give and extend. And ultimately, all history should be accessible to all peoples. So that's ultimately what I would say. And we need to take risks in doing that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dolly. I will pass on to Anna.
Hi. Thank you, Lucy. Fabulous. Thank you, Dolly. Prompted lots of thoughts which I won't be able to address here. But yeah, so the way Dolly introduced herself made me start thinking about, well, what exactly am I? I taught for, God, 15 years at Edinburgh in Scottish and British history, but also then more towards the end on historical methodologies, of which one of them was public history, and that was informed by some work which maybe we can talk about later in the practicalities of trying to do this stuff in the questions. Sort of public engagement type projects for academic research. And then 4 years ago, I transferred to the museum and I started to put into practice some of the things that I've been teaching and perhaps hadn't reflected long enough on. So I would say that I'm an academic reflecting on the presentation of and engagement with material culture, but I'm also a museum professional reflecting on academia and its approaches to public history, which sort of leaves me a bit uncomfortable sitting in between the two. I thought what I'd talk about first is a project that I don't think was specifically a public engagement project, though it certainly had a public history element to it, which was Stephen Reed's RSE funded network at the University of Glasgow on the memorialisation of Mary, Queen of Scots, which the two principal outputs that came from, I think it was a series of about 8 workshops, were the Hunterian had an exhibition on the afterlife of Mary, taking that afterlife right up into the 21st century and thinking about Mary in drag culture, Mary in cartoons and so on. And also a book for Edinburgh University Press, so an explicitly scholarly output as well. So I thought I'd think about the chapter that I wrote for that book, which really came out of 2 years of thinking about this as that project progressed, and then briefly think about some of the audience research that I've been doing more recently at the museum. So Mary is one of the most recognised figures in Scottish and British history, and objects relating to her at National Museum of Scotland, and you can see the gallery here, the principal gallery. It's actually been added to recently with more things to do with Mary. This gallery containing these objects, they're a huge draw for thousands of visitors. I mean, I do mean thousands of visitors. You often go in that gallery and they're clustered around the tomb that you can see there, and they're looking at the jewelry, they're looking at the casket. And these visitors invest, many of whom invest emotion, empathy, or meaning in them. And that meaning is derived from their alleged association with Mary. However, these objects do vary in the strength of that provenance. So I'm really trying to think about, how do we cope with that? How do we engage with that in a museum setting in a way that recognises the difficulties over provenance, whilst recognising also the significance of the non-specialist voice in understanding the significance of those meanings? There are very few bodily relics that can be verified as pertaining to Mary. In fact, really not any. And certainly none resulting from her execution. A fire was burning at the behest of the Elizabethan government even before her head left her body, and her blood-stained clothing was consigned immediately to it. However, over the longer term, these measures proved ineffective against the perpetuation of Mary's memory through other types of objects associated with her, which have achieved over the centuries relic status. Her jewelry, embroidery, beds she slept in, gifts she made, things she might have touched, and mementos, particularly jewelry, created to memorialise her. In this process, Mary herself was active. She gave objects to seal alliance, often with her own image contained within them, which were meant to act as physical representations of Mary in her bodily absence. As she approached death, these gifts were made consciously to project her presence beyond her mortal life and to secure a lasting reputation as a royal Catholic martyr. Over the long years since, those objects have been invested with deep meaning by their owners and their audiences, a meaning derived from that alleged association. Many of them, however, survive with only limited, often dubious provenance. So in a museum context, this leaves us with several challenges in interpreting the objects that relate to her. She's one of the most recognised and iconic figures in Scottish history and a huge public draw in fiction and drama and at heritage sites. The museum, National Museum of Scotland, held Mary Queen of Scots exhibition in 2013, and it was one of their most popular exhibitions ever held. Inevitably, these visitors apply their own, often firmly held assumptions and previous knowledge to framing the Marian objects they see on display, as do, and they're very often different understandings, the guides that give tours, as do the museum professionals that curate, collect, conserve, and classify them, choices being made the whole time. All of us, academics and administrators alike, inescapably operate with incomplete understandings of the many-faceted Mary and her Scottish, British, and European contexts. And any version of Mary presented can't capture the significance of all these multiple stories and perspectives. So a curator can shape narratives that we present in the gallery, informed by the latest research, and we can certainly influence the perception of Mary in the 21st century, but we can't control the reception and reinterpretation of Marian-related objects by their audiences. As a result, no object used in telling Mary's life has only one meaning, and thus there can never be only one authoritative narrative. So my chapter considered the multiplicity of those meanings and the authority that these might give to multiple narratives of her life and times. So taking it more into an academic sphere, recent research in material culture and public history has foregrounded the socially constructed and historically contingent nature of an object's meaning. Marian objects thus have multiple meanings dependent on who is seeing them and when and within what context. It follows, therefore, that the meanings of objects associated with Mary are as Marian as we each understand them to be, whether their provenance is authentic or more ambiguous. As each of us invest our own meanings in the objects we view, those objects are given meaning in relation to Mary, no matter how dubious those connections might be. So how then should a museum engage with that multiplicity of understandings in the curation of these objects? How should tensions between audience expectation and assumptions and current scholarship be negotiated alongside due acknowledgements over the ambiguities of ownership and provenance? And finally, just how important is authenticity in the presentation of objects in the museum, and how might changing cultural and historical contexts affect understandings of authenticity, of the authentic object, of its historical truth? So putting this theory into practice, if we acknowledge that ambivalence that frames these objects, I've asked what methods could therefore be deployed to provide more nuanced narratives in museum spaces, which make explicit the object's multifaceted ambiguities whilst making them relatable and relevant to today's audiences. If establishing authenticity has been a defining rationale for museum collections in the past, how might actually embracing ambiguity in the present affect the role of the museum in its engagement with Mary and her audiences? And to cut a long story short, I conclude that the role of the audience should become much more integral to collecting, curating, narrating, and display practices to represent the multiple Marys in our minds, no matter how non-specialist that understanding may be. It is authentic within its own terms. Taking that one step further into the sort of printed academic sphere, scholarly approaches to objects with Mary are quite often predicated on the authenticity, back to the authenticity question of that association. But this has prompted me, for me, deeper questions about the nature of that authenticity. And I think too easily do we gently mock there were somewhat more dubious associations of, you know, the wood from the tree that she kissed Darnley under, or the bed, or the snippet of the embroidery. I just noticed a new snippet's come up for sale. In conversations with academics prior to writing my chapter, there was a distinct whiff, if you like, an assumption that museum puts stuff on displays because it gets the punters in, rather than overly worrying about provenance. But I think my answer to this is the meaning of all objects being historically contingent, then and now, means that that object only means as much as the person interacting with it perceives or believes. It can carry stories, but ultimately the way in which an individual reacts is shaped by their own beliefs and contexts. And I think that that individual meaning making gives an object authenticity within its own terms in that specific interaction. So I think that should help to problematize understandings of what is authentic within a museum setting, and suggesting that the audience's reception of and engagement with Marian objects needs to be integrated more into our displaying of it, and it complicates any museum authored interpretation. Finally, I would suggest that the museum needs to take a step back in gatekeeping that authoritative narrative, the authentic object. Mary in the 21st century is what we individually make of her, and that these understandings should be recognized as meaningful, whether specialist or non-specialist. So that was the theory. That's what went into the article. So then I just want to juxtapose that with a little bit of audience research that I did around, it was in fact prompted by the acquisition of a very expensive but completely amazing silver casket that is supposed to, is thought to have been owned by Mary, and perhaps to have carried the casket letters. It's certainly being believed so by the Hambleton family, in whose hands it's rested for 350 years at least, coming then to us. And we tried to run these focus groups. We ran 3 focus groups, really to ask about their interest in Mary and her status as a historical figure, national historical figure, interest in the objects and how to make connections with Mary that maybe span those centuries, the relevance of empathy and emotion in relation to objects, and then thinking about those objects as cultural national heritage. And we were sort of also thinking about using this for how we might interpret other significant historical figures going forwards in the Scotland galleries. There were some immediate challenges. I mean, those focus groups, they're quite hard to assemble. And I think that in itself is sort of a project, because it's you tend to get interested participants, but we actually, if we want to diversify our audiences, we need to be diversifying our focus groups. And despite a huge effort by the company that did this for us, we ended up pretty much with same old, and that was challenging and slightly frustrating. And secondly, working with a sort of industry professional for focus groups is trying to get them to actually understand the intellectual underpinning of what I was trying to get at in terms of emotion and relation to objects, and to go beyond the, well, where do you come from and how many times do you come to a museum type question. But anyway, there were a few things that came out of that. They put Mary certainly up there with, who do we have? Rob Roy, Alexandra Graham Bell, John Knox, Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, and various Jameses. People said, we asked them, where did you find out about this history? People talked about novels by Nigel Tranter, John Preble, and some people also talked about, I use this quite a lot, the Netflix series Rain is quite often someone's introduction into the subject. We then asked about the emotion. So can we move on, Lucy, to the first? We gave them 2 slides. We gave them a slide with these ones, objects directly associated with Mary, and then we gave them another slide, objects that have a much more dubious provenance. So sorry, these are the indirectly, yeah. Thank you. Thanks. And it was interesting to see their reaction to it. So to these, there definitely was a feeling that yes, because there is a sort of more or less proven or a very well attested connection to Mary, that there was some form of emotional or something more than just simply an object on display. It came with a person and a story attaching to it. And people said things like, yes, I'm imagining her fingers passing over the beads as she prays, particularly around the pennycook beads that she gave to her attendant shortly before her execution. One participant said that makes a massive change to me personally, to have these things that have a direct history. They were so important. She kept them close to her until death. She had those in prison. That does make those more interesting for me. So it's the story that makes those things interesting, but then it allows an emotional connection as well. And then I sort of took it on to asking, how should we try and capture this in a museum, these sort of Mary as more than just an object, these objects, as beautiful as they are. And there was a lot of sort of disagreement, really, which was great, from these groups. Some of them can't bear the soundscape, and I've heard that from a lot of people, because it's interfering with the ways in which they are personally engaging with those objects. It interferes. They want 3D, they want more online, all of which I'm up for. I want a hologram of the spaces that she used these objects in. So there was a lot of sort of diverse opinion about how meaningful these objects were. And if we can go back to that next slide, Lucy. But what really came out of it also was that the objects indirectly associated with her. So for instance, the Craig Miller crucifix, an object said to have been found in a bedroom that was hers at Craig Miller. It's obviously not, but there was very much less, as you might expect, emotional engagement with them. Where am I going with all this? I think really what I'm trying to say is that one of the surprising things that came out of the of this audience research was that actually the level of engagement was perhaps less than I was expecting from people that were drawn to museum focused research. It did slightly make me rethink the article that I'd written, because I'm not sure a lot of the theory appeared to be playing out exactly in practice. But I do think also what it showed and confirms in relation particularly to what we're doing today is that if that going forwards, that we really need to consider those audience invested meanings as integral to our displays, that we integrate that non-specialist voice instead as an active participant in museum work going forward, and loosen our stranglehold on the gatekeeping of knowledge and narrative around them. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I'll pass over to Rachel now. I'm going to stop sharing the slides for this section.
Thanks so much, Lucy, and thanks Anna and Dolly for really fascinating insights. I've been madly scribbling away, so I'm sure I'll be following up with you both afterwards. So my contribution isn't anchored in a specific example of a project, just because I couldn't decide on which one to talk about. So it's more kind of general methodological reflections, but hopefully that will provide a segue into our discussions afterwards. So my current role, as Lucy said, is as the Heritage Partnerships Coordinator in the Humanities Division at the University of Oxford. And I'll explain a little bit more, well, quite a bit more about what that entails in just a moment. But I also have a background as an academic historian. So today I want to think about public history with an early modern lens, wearing two different yet related hats. So the first is my public engagement work as an academic, and then the second is with my partnerships or my brokering hat on. So like Anna, I occupy this sort of odd space between the two worlds. So a bit of background then about how I came to public engagement in the first place. My doctoral thesis was on elite women who commissioned and headed their own houses in late medieval and early Tudor England, and I've subsequently gone on to publish around themes of gender, patronage and material culture during the later medieval and early modern periods. I think it's important to say for the purposes of our discussion today that my doctorate and subsequent postdocs weren't embedded into heritage organisations. I really wish they were. I wish I'd had that opportunity. But yeah, when I was beginning my academic journey, there were very few, if any, collaborative opportunities available. And I think that this is something we might want to reflect upon during the discussion, actually. The fact that many heritage organisations in the UK have relatively recently obtained independent research organisation or IRO status, enabling them to host doctoral students and postdocs, which means that the capacity for embedding collaborative working from an early career stage is now much more common practice than it has been in the past. So we might want to think about how this is perhaps shifting the culture of how we view and write about public history in both academic and non-academic discourse. So as I said, although my work wasn't formally affiliated to any particular heritage organisation, the topic of my research naturally lends itself to heritage contexts, and specifically a broad eagerness across the sector to diversify beyond the sort of dominant narratives of the elite white male. So I've been involved in several heritage-facing projects over the years, which variously came about through a combination of applying for opportunities, being asked to be involved in things by making people aware of my work through my digital and in-person networks, and by also proactively asking where my research might be useful in heritage contexts. So when I had a postdoc at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Edinburgh, for example, I just got in touch with Historic Environment Scotland and said, this is what I'm working on, let me know if it's interesting to you, and please keep me posted if there are any opportunities for collaborative working. And that's proved particularly fruitful. I'm still doing bits and pieces of work up in Scotland now, even though I've moved back down to Oxford. So to give you some examples of outputs then, my work as an academic in the heritage space has involved designing a walking tour and panel display on medieval royal women of influence in Coventry for the city's Heritage Open Days, authoring a research report for new interpretation of properties in the care of Historic Environment Scotland, and co-authoring a policy paper on creative repurposing, levelling up and urban renewal as part of an ECR internship with the Institute for Historical Research's Centre for People, Place and Community. Now, all of these projects have been relatively self-contained. So the panel display and walking tour in Coventry was designed for a specific event, and that was the city's 2018 Heritage Open Days. Although, as Dolly says, you never know where these collaborations might lead. So that panel display and walking tour is actually back on display at the moment. It was also part of the 2021 City of Culture celebrations in Coventry, and I've been invited back to give a talk on that as well. So yeah, sometimes these sort of self-contained projects can lead to unexpected places as well. Then the work I did for HES fed into an interpretation panel and an audio guide, and the Levelling Up paper for history and policy was part of a fixed-term funded opportunity. So although with the Coventry project it sort of continued in a way, there was no baked in or follow-on funding with any of these projects. Although I've been proactive about discussing them at conferences and other events where I've been able to since, although it's difficult to find space for this sort of work when you're looking at sort of publications other than public history journals. And I know that this is something we're going to reflect upon a bit more in the Q&A afterwards. So to put my other hat on then, now I just want to consider a bit about how my perspective on public history and knowledge exchange has changed slightly since moving into a brokering space just under a year ago. So Heritage Partnerships at Oxford is quite unusual in that we're a dedicated full-time team that sits within professional services in the humanities division. And we effectively provide a brokering service between academic researchers and external heritage organisations, with research as the underpinning factor. So as I said, I'm an academic, and my colleague and the head of the team, Alice Purkis, comes from a background in the museum sector. So together we manage relationships with a wide range of local, national and international partners, from the National Trust, with whom Oxford has a formalised partnership, to historic royal palaces, English heritage, and more local and smaller organisations such as Blenheim Palace and the Charterhouse in London. And we do this through wide-ranging incremental activities, ranging from student internships and placements, collaborative doctorates to fellowships and multi-partner bids. And a core part of our jobs really is diagnosing and understanding the research context and trends, and also the needs across the two sectors. And the projects I'm involved in with my partnerships hat on are extremely broad-ranging, from National Trust library collections and modernist homes to torture and execution at the Tower of London and women's histories at the Charterhouse. So there's a really broad spectrum of projects that we're involved in. Although we support collaborations between individual academics and heritage partners, our work is much more about culture building and thematic ways of working. With the National Trust, for example, we currently have 11 core themes which span the entire portfolio of the Trust's sites and properties. So we work at curatorial rather than property level. And then under those 11 themes, we have various activities that I've mentioned, like the student internships, the collaborative doctoral awards, knowledge exchange fellowships, and then these kind of larger funding bids as well. And then we also have themes that span multiple heritage sites. So at the moment, for example, I'm working on well-being and heritage, which is something which speaks to several of our partners, for example. So some of them might not be contained to one specific heritage organisation. And to bring this back to early modern history a bit then, we do actually have quite a few early modern academics involved in our collaborations. This is obviously a strength in Oxford's sort of academic expertise, although our work is largely driven by the needs of our heritage partners. So it's usually our partners coming to us and then us identifying where we have particular research strengths or academics that can speak to those areas. And it's also fair to say that more recent history, I think, tends to speak more obviously to policy priority areas, such as well-being, which I mentioned, climate change and levelling up, for example. And these areas, of course, tend to unlock the bigger pots of money. So we as early modernists sometimes have to work much harder to make ourselves seen and to seem relevant as well in these conversations. So I just want to finish up with some observations that then might feed into our discussion. The heritage and public engagement projects are often limited in terms of both timescale and resource, meaning that scope for longer term reflections and legacies isn't always baked in from the start or even possible. Structurally, academic conferences and publications don't always privilege reflections on methodologies and heritage outputs, meaning that traditional scholarship, and I'm using those inverted commas there, often takes precedence. And in the UK, I think this is a bigger structural problem. I think impact is really seen as a distinct strand, and that silos these conversations and these projects. So while the ref acknowledges impact and knowledge exchange, it also creates a problem. I think another important thing for us to reflect on is precarity in both sectors, actually, because it means that continuity can be stunted. So all the public engagement work that I did prior to joining the Heritage Partnerships team, for example, was done when I was on fixed term contracts. So there's a lot of great work being done by early career researchers, but a change in institution, the energy involved in applying for hundreds of jobs, and also leaving academia altogether means that growth is often curbed. And also, if you want to build an impact case study from a university perspective, you do need a permanent position. So it means that you're not necessarily able to grow those threads that you may have started as an ECR. Another one that I think is really important is that knowledge exchange isn't just about impact. And often I think universities conflate the two things. So fostering a culture of working collaboratively and making it an embedded part. Sorry, I've realised I've used the word embedded about 4 times in this this presentation, but I think it's really important. So yeah, making it an embedded part of our practice rather than a bolt-on or a nice to have is really important. So successful partnerships, as I've learned in the last year, really grow through trust and the knowledge of the needs and ways of working of our collaborators as well. And that just can't be achieved overnight. And then the final one then is that, as I've said already, I think we as early modernists have to work doubly hard to show our relevance. Barriers such as paleography, as Dolly mentioned earlier, and period-specific belief systems that might seem sort of alien to modern audiences means that historians working on more recent periods can often seem to have more immediate relevance. And as I've said, you know, this is particularly useful for them when it comes to sort of policy priorities and unlocking pots of money. But we are relevant, and how, as we all know, and how we talk about and communicate our work and skills, I think, is one way as part of a broader matrix of things that we can look to challenge this misconception. And I think I'll stop there because I realise we're nearly at time.
Thank you very much, everybody. There's been so many ideas I've just literally scribbled the whole way through. Thank you so much to everybody for all the points that have been raised. I think across all of the speakers, one of our key points did come up a lot, and that idea of compartmentalizing things and the barriers that are put up by either by funding or institutionally or perhaps by perceptions. And I wondered if maybe any of the speakers or anybody in the audience would like to come in and speak about one of those things, about that issue of compartmentalization, and whether that do people agree that that's a big challenge for us? Is there anything we can do to get past that challenge? We know that that's not just an early modern challenge. That's an everybody that does public history kind of challenge. That idea of compartmentalization, of whether it be to do with it being knowledge exchange and impact somehow being weirdly disconnected from one another, when really they should be connected, and institutions seeing what we do as researchers and what we do as outreach as different things, and these sorts of things, and also that issue that you mentioned about funding as well, and about I think we'll go on to legacy and funding, but I think that's a really important one as well. But I just wondered if anybody had any points that they'd like to come in terms of what kind of things might we do to challenge that issue of compartmentalization in moving forward from where we are now. What kind of things do people think we could do, if there is anything at all? David.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting presentation to everybody. In terms of compartmentalizing, I think I'd maybe just want to think about 2 terms we use, which we take for granted and understandably take for granted, but we probably should think about. And one is public history itself. Thanks for your multiple definitions of it, Lucy, because I think we have multiple definitions of it. People working or involved in things beyond the university will have probably don't use the term at all. And I think that's an interesting point. I've talked about this a bit with colleagues, and in some ways community history is a much clearer term for anybody. You know, it's pretty obvious to some extent what that means, but I think that's something that is a challenge to start with, that when you use the term public history and you talk to people beyond the university and say, I'm trying to do public history, first you have to get into a pretty lengthy discussion about what that means, understandably, because it's not common parlance at all. And I think the other term for us is early modern. Again, lots of people beyond the university are interested in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, but they don't often use that term. And I think that, so I guess all what I'm saying is just for us to reflect on that. So we're probably partly responsible for the compartmentalizing ourselves, because we don't think and we don't use the inclusive language that we might think that we're using. And I blame myself for that in part.
Yes, Charlotte, I think your hand came up first.
Yeah, I was just thinking, sort of this issue of compartmentalizing kind of getting in the way. I think an added barrier to that is that sort of that elitism. You meet, and I don't think there's anybody in the room who falls under this, but you do meet a lot of academics whose immediate reaction to the idea of public history, popular history, is sort of, oh no, we don't do that. And in the other vein, I think you meet a lot of people outside of academia who, as soon as they get the impression that you're from an academic background, they kind of sort of step back a bit, and they're automatically not sure whether you're going to relate to them and they're going to relate to you, what you're saying. I'm not sure if I'm sort of making it clear here, but I think possibly something that we ought to look at doing is kind of breaking down that barrier by getting out, and I think that's what everybody here is probably trying to do, is kind of get out into the field, if you like, and sort of prove to people that academic history, academic research doesn't have to be inaccessible. Hopefully I'm making some sense. I won't keep going.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlotte. Anna, you had your hand up as well. I think you're still muted, Anna.
Sorry, I got something else, but just in response to what Charlotte said, that I think talking, greater dialogue is just absolutely key. So the work like that Rachel, for instance, is doing in brokering is incredibly important. And it's having that discussion that helps to establish relationships and trust and understanding, and doing that almost before you start making a project. It's about establishing relationships. And this is what I found is one of the biggest things that I've come to understand moving to the museum from academia, is that dialogue needs to happen way, way, way more in advance than anyone thinks it does. So that in the way that you're saying, non-academics responding to an academic coming with the latest piece of research and so on, that it's that relationship building needs to happen on a much broader, wider level right from the start. The other thing I was thinking in terms of compartmentalization and relevance, and it was partly picking up on also what Rachel was saying about for early modern, and I accept David's thing as well on, what do the public understand about early modern as a term, is that early modern is in itself obviously a periodization. It's therefore a compartmentalization. And that makes it much harder for us to make it relevant in the 21st century. So it's about thinking about how you can bridge that gap between the 21st century and the 16th century that will help to make it relevant in today. And one of those ways of making it relevant is how the public, whoever they are, which bit that you're thinking about, come to that subject. And it may be through all sorts of different kinds of media, and different levels of knowledge or specialist knowledge. And it's acknowledging that. This is really what I was trying to say, is that acknowledging contemporary response to the past is just so important in making sure it's relevant today, and getting that funding and getting that project in place.
Thanks very much, Anna. I think that point that you made about like the early stages in which you have to start having these conversations in terms of doing they have to be long before the projects, and I think that sort of speaks to some of the other challenges that we have. It's sort of a vicious circle of that Rachel was saying about the pots of money associated with impact or knowledge exchange tend to be with a deadline of yesterday, and they cover 3 weeks worth of work, and they don't, that the funding doesn't appreciate the time that is required to actually create the relationships that you need to do public history well, if that makes sense. That always seems to be. I'm aware that we've gone over time, but that we have 2 hands up and a question in the chat. I'm going to pose the question in the chat to the speakers separately by email, if that's okay, because it's slightly different to what we've been talking about, Stephen. I hope that's okay. And then ask Siobhan to come in with your hand. You had your hand up.
Hi there. It was kind of taking in what David had said about community histories and what Anna's just been talking about, creating relationships. And I think that both academics and kind of museum professionals have kind of traditionally forgotten about key stakeholder within that, and that is the actual communities themselves and how they portray their history and how they want their history told. And I think that it would be interesting to hear from any of the speakers or from anybody else where you think that progress is going, what's the line that we need to go down, what are the key areas where we need to look at, key topics, and maybe how to bring them on board more. Be interesting to hear.
I guess I could add something to that. So along with the Heritage Partnerships team that we have in Oxford, we also have a community history fellow who sits in the history faculty, Dr. Priya Atwal, and she's involved, you know, again, it's a job that needs to be invested in, you know, talking to communities, thinking about the town and gown divide, which, as you probably all know, has been historically very strong in Oxford and still is. And she's talking to the community about diverse histories, industrial heritage, all sorts of different topics. But again, it involves universities investing in those brokering roles. And, you know, because it takes time for her to build these projects and build trust with the community around Oxford as well.
And I could probably add to that as well that the thing that's really curious about this, the idea that the legacies are there with permanent staff, well, if you don't have a collective of early modernists together, you don't end up with a kind of sense of being able to build a project and build a legacy. The other thing is that in terms of community projects, I found as the early modernist, I was being approached by communities, contemporary history people, to come and how could they work with a project like that? And I think that's really interesting too. It's about how people get out into the public, how people become accessible, and break down that notion of an academic is unapproachable. But again, the notion of the legacy is really, really curious. As soon as you step away, your legacy steps away, and it doesn't matter whether you're an early career doing absolutely brilliant stuff or whether you're an old, you know, dyed-in-the-wool permanent member of staff. If you step away, that is certainly in the Australian context, that area dies with you. So I think the impact of the university system and cultural heritage systems also needs to be viewed in terms of how these realities come about. And then how do we, as Siobhan said, you know, how do we get the communities to then actually be able to drive their own projects and their own interests?
And I guess as academics, we're all part of our local communities, right? We all live in these areas, and it's funny that when we're doing these projects, we tend to put like our academic hats on, but actually, you know, we benefit from the communities, and we are part of those communities as much as the people we're partnering with are as well.
But not every historian's like that. That's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks very much. I'm going to turn to Scott's got his hand up as well, and we'll just do one last question, and then we'll have to wrap things up, I'm afraid.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'll try to make this brief. It was a point that I picked up during Anna's presentation, and I've scribbled it down as basically getting the punters in, as it was put, versus credibility in relation to sort of organisational reputation. So if I picked up the point correctly, we're talking about how the museum engages with the multiple connections and understandings that people have in relation to collections and objects, almost not regardless of provenance, but certainly not purely based around authenticity. And And if the role of the audience is integral to the whole process, then I was wondering how it was mentioned at the beginning and during the introduction about management of risk and this perception of risk. I understood that to be potential reputational or professional risk, or even organizational risk. So is there a potential risk in watering down the need for this? It's almost like there's an insufficiency of evidence in relation to an object, but it doesn't really matter that much, because what's more important is the public's engagement with that object rather than the provenance. Does that then generate or result in professional, organizational, reputational risk?
Can I respond? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's really, really great question. And yeah, this is something that we play with all the time. And my own institution historically has been very risk averse, I would say. So I think that has limited the ways in which we could present. I'm just going to stay with Mary, but it could apply to any other slightly mythologized Scottish historical figure. I think we need to be a bit more adventurous, and that might come with some sort of risk in terms of what people might then say about it. But I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that no one will ever agree on everything. And I think if we make the distinction between, yes, ambiguous provenance and meaning making as that they're slightly different things, and as long as we communicate that clearly enough, I think we are then responding not only to our 21st century audience, which I think is one of our core duties. We are about creating accessibility and information for those audiences, and to think about how they respond and engage with them. And then also to acknowledge at the other side the sort of more scholarly approach, and the more that sort of authenticity in terms of provenance. But I think one of the ways we can do this, and this is what I'm arguing for in my own institution, and no idea of funding, space, logistics, institutional bureaucracy, decision making, all of that. These are challenges. But one of the things I would like to see in our museum, and there's certainly, I think, a little bit of appetite for, is more flexible spaces where we can do more responsive, short-term things that dare to do things that may exactly encounter some sort of risk in reputation, that we actually play with that we engage with it, and allow that to happen, but within a space that isn't then written into the stone of a permanent gallery. What we have in the museum is a real problem, that our displays have been up for 28 years, and that huge research has gone on since then, and we've got new objects and so on that we can't include in displays and so on. One way to deal with that kind of problem is to have something that's more responsive, something that you could have as a community-led exhibition or short-term display that actually gets those communities into a museum within and in a presentation that gives that voice its due prominence, at the same time as acknowledging, the more ambiguous nature of some of these objects.
Thanks very much, Anna. I think that's really that idea of those flexible spaces sounds really fascinating in terms of being able to give richness to that idea of multiplicity that came through in so many of your your presentation, but also in that idea of there are multiple histories. Each person has talked about that idea of the multiplicity of history and how we have to engage with that and embrace it as part of what we're doing if we're going to what we're doing as historians on an everyday basis, not just when we take it outside into the public forum. I'm going to have to wrap things up there because I'm very aware that we've gone quite a bit over time, and I probably should have scheduled this for an hour and a half, not an hour. But it's been an absolutely lovely discussion, and I hope that we can carry it on. I've got a couple of questions that I've taken out of the chat that I will I will take back to the speakers and get some and get their thoughts, and we can perhaps think of a way to carry on this conversation in another forum at a different time. But thank you so much to everybody that has taken part. Thank you to Anna, Rachel and Dolly for their time, and thank you to you all for giving up your lunch hour potentially to come along and listen as well. I just wanted to quickly let you know that we are next couple of events we're hosting the Royal Historical Society at the Centre for History at Dornoch on Monday the 18th of September, and this includes a Royal Historical Society sponsored talk by Professor Lucy Noakes from the University of Essex titled "In the Memory of My Great-Grandfather and His Infant Son, Histories, Communities and Feelings in the Centenary of the First World War." And that's at 5:30. And then our next History Talk live event is on Thursday the 5th of October, and we're welcoming back our recent UHI graduate Dr. Derek Bratt, and he will be presenting a talk on titled "Spare a Thought for the Excisemen, Looking at the Social World of Whisky Smuggling" from 5:30 to 6:30, and that's on the 5th of October. And you can find more details about that talk on the History Talks Live webpage as well. Thank you so much to everybody who's taken part. I really enjoyed it, and I've scribbled down so many questions and thoughts. So thank you so much.